Remember, Paul was a Roman citizen. How would a Jew in a wealthy city like Tarsus get Roman citizenship? There were a couple of ways, one of which was bribery. The other one was being a slave and being freed. To be a freed man, if you were owned by a Roman citizen. Now, one of the things that we need to understand here is that in those days, there were all different kinds of slavery. And for the prosperous household and the slaves that they would really be members of the household. And the owners, the householder, had a responsibility towards them. Now, they could do with them as they willed, and some of them could be very, very cruel, but nonetheless, they had a responsibility towards them, and if they freed them, and they themselves were Roman citizens, they could give their Roman citizenship also to the slaves that they freed. That is Jerome Murphy O'Connor's speculation as to how Paul got his Roman citizenship, that he used to good advantage, as we know later in his life. So, Tarsus was his hometown, not his birthplace. And now, right next to that well that you saw before was there's some walls that are covered over with glass, and it's identified as Paul's house. Whether that actually is the excavation of Paul's family house or not, it's just as good as any place. So it is very likely that they had a nice house, that they were prosperous, because they were good and industrious slaves that were more valuable being freed than being slaves. So whether they were merchants or business people of some sort, it's pretty sure that his family was not a family of tent makers. They would not have been wealthy, or craftspeople. They would not have been wealthy. But Paul's family was able to afford to send a teenage Paul to Jerusalem for his education. And it was, what the family's religious, affiliation as Jews might be, whether they themselves were Pharisees or not, they may well have been of some kind of, very, very religious sentiment. But Paul certainly took on his study of the Torah as a Pharisee very, very seriously. And so he became a student in Jerusalem. Now, his family had to be wealthy because students could not support themselves. They had to have either a wealthy donor or several wealthy donors or a wealthy family to support them there. So this is, again, Jerome Murphy O'Connor's speculation, and I think there is some good things to say about that. So Paul spent his young adulthood in Jerusalem. And here's a reconstruction of the temple. This would have been a very, very familiar sight to him and would probably have made his heart beat faster. Maybe for a couple of reasons that we won't go into. Now, there is a question. Was Paul married? He gives no indication of that. But Murphy O'Connor says, he probably lived in Jerusalem if he was born when he was born, and if he went there to study. He lived in Jerusalem at least off and on as a passionate and committed Pharisee for as long as 20 years. It was completely unheard of for a Pharisee not to be married. Now, I'm tempted to give a little footnote about Jesus. Jesus was not a Pharisee. That's pretty clear. Jesus' family may vary, and here's where Bargill Pixner's research comes in. Jesus' family may very well have been influenced by the Essenes. And to take a vow of celibacy or a vow of virginity was not unusual among the Essenes. That sheds a lot of light on the Virgin Mary. It would not be all that, she would not raise eyebrows by being a virgin. Even a virgin married to an older man who already had a family. Remember where Jesus' brothers came from. Some theologians have said they were his cousins, but the common opinion in the Eastern Church has been that the so-called brothers and sisters of Jesus were actually Joseph's children by a former marriage. His wife died, and he married the Virgin Mary as a way of sheltering her, protecting her, keeping her good name and her good reputation intact. So again, marrying a virgin and having a vow of virginity would not have been an unusual thing there. Nor would it have necessarily been unusual for her, to have decided later, as maybe most of the people of the town thought, well, this is too much for me to handle and all of that. But the fact of Mary's virginity is not that much of a problem. Neither is Jesus' celibacy. Celibacy for Paul would have been a problem. He could not have been celibate as a Pharisee. Now, he never mentions a wife and a family. Murphy O'Connor speculates that they very likely died, possibly tragically, in a fire, in an accident, and it was a very painful experience for him. And I think there's speculation about two very painful experiences in Paul's life that he never talked about. This is one of them. We'll get to the other one in just a minute. Did Paul ever meet Jesus? There's an interesting speculation. If Saul, was in Jerusalem at the same time Jesus was there, could he have been one of those ardent Pharisees that Jesus argued with? No proof of that, but it's an interesting speculation. And if so, after his conversion, after his experience of the risen Jesus, and Jesus reaching out to him and extending great favor to him, it could be that those encounters with Jesus as an adversary were such a painful memory that he never mentioned it. Except maybe indirectly. There's one verse in 2 Corinthians 5:16. Even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, yet we know him so no longer. Does that refer to his maybe having met Jesus? Maybe. Maybe not. I'm not going to absolutely say, this is conclusive proof. But he did encounter Jesus a couple of years after the resurrection. And he encountered the risen Jesus. Now, get ready for a real anachronism. For one thing, he wasn't riding a horse. I don't know if in the midst of all of this mess that Rubens gives us here, you can see the horse. I think it's there. Here's another horse with a soldier on it. He may have been traveling with other companions, certainly, but he would have been walking. And they would have been dressed in very, very simple garb. They wouldn't have been dressed like a soldier or half naked or whatever here. Whatever the experience was on the road to Damascus, it turned him around completely. And of course, the artists try to make it very grandiose. But they're really trying to capture the significance and the emotion of that scene rather than the literal historical details. It would have been 3 or 4 or 5 people walking on a Roman road, dressed in ordinary garb, and suddenly having a striking religious experience. And we can leave it at that.